Welcome to this afternoon's session, which is titled Populism and Social Media, the New Instruments of Right-Wing Power. My name is Tara Milbrandt, and I will be facilitating this afternoon's session. We have two speakers, and they will be presenting in the order in which they appear in the program: David Terrace and Nora Loreto. And so the way that today's panel will be structured, the speakers will each present, and then there will be a collective question and answer discussion period following the second presenter. So our first presenter will be David Terrace. David holds the Ralph Klein Chair in Media Studies at Mount Royal University. Seriously. He is the author with Christopher Waddle of The End of the CBC, ? And a co-editor of Power Shift, Political Leadership and Social Media. Both books will be out in early 2020. Terrace is also a political commentator on the Global Morning News in Calgary. Our second presenter is Nora Loreto. Nora is a writer, a podcaster, and an activist. She is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labour Media, and she writes regularly for the National Observer and the Washington Post. You can hear Nora talk politics with Sandy Hudson every week at www.sandyandnora.com. Nora is currently working on a book that examines the state of Canada's feminist movement and arguing what we've lost as it's atrophied. It will be released in the fall of 2020. So please join me in welcoming our presenters.
Thank you, Tara. This is the first time I'm wearing one of these gizmos, so it's all very Star Trek-y to me. So I just want to say that I noticed among my students, so I teach at Mount Royal University and also at the University of Calgary, and I've noticed a big transition in the last 5 years. If you dial back 5 years ago, students would report a mix of conventional media and online media. So they'd watch the evening news, they'd read newspapers, and they would be online. But in the recent transition, again, which I think started 5 years ago, they're exclusively online. So it's Instagram, it's Facebook Live, it's YouTube, it's Netflix, it's WhatsApp, it's Snap, it's tweets, and most of all, it's through cell phones. So cell phones are used roughly 3 times an hour. So if you do basic math, 30 to 50 times a day. So if you go and you do sort of an examination in class and you say, does that mean the end of cable? Does that mean the end of the CBC? Does that mean the end of magazines? Does that mean the end of conventional local television? And their answer is yes. Now we'll see what happens, but it's an ominous development. If you're a TV executive and you go into my class, you want to jump off a cliff afterwards. Now, political leaders have also made the transition. So leaders of major political parties operate what is basically a 24-hour-a-day news organization. They post roughly 10 times a day, and their posts are designed to spread. So you know, the old comment is, or the new comment is, if you don't spread, you're dead. So, you know, they have all the ingredients in a post that will trigger a viral response. And it's the backbone of parties in terms of fundraising, in terms of meetups, in terms of party organization, in terms of voter ID, in terms of data collection. It's the heart of your organization. Now, American political parties, and I realize this is an extreme, have roughly 1,000 data points on every voter. So I have a friend who's a Democratic chairman in a red state. And I said, what are you looking at? And he says, well, I mean, I see everything. You know, how they voted, what they subscribe to, the TV programs they watch, you know, what their interests are, what their professional history is, where they live. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Now, as soon as you post, as soon as the politician posts, you lose control. You're instantly exposed and you're instantly vulnerable to meme attacks, to culture jamming, to mashups, to mockery, to counter-programming. So to give two innocent examples, last week Boris Johnson had this wonderful ad. I thought it was wonderful, not that I approve of him, but the ad was very interesting. It was going, you know, it was backstage at Tory party election headquarters, and it's him going to get a cup of coffee, and he's talking about the music he likes and how he grew up, and you know the athletes he likes, and you know, and then finally gets to politics. But they follow him through the headquarters, and then as soon as it's posted, right? I mean, it's just a mob attack, and he's memed and he's mocked. AOC, you know, elected as a congresswoman. Her first day in office, she has a beautiful designer jacket, which was, you know, very nice. So she's going to her first day to work as a congressperson, and this mob attack, right? You shouldn't be dressed that way, right? You who are elected by poor people shouldn't be dressed that way. And it's also that the speed freaks are in control. You can't allow anything to go unanswered. You have to respond instantly. There's two kinds of politicians now, the quick and the dead. And the velocity at which this moves is extraordinary. And it's also the case that the internet never forgets. It never forgets the slip of the tongue. It never forgets, you know, the bad designer of clothes, the half thought, the half idea, when you're disheveled, when you're bleary-eyed, when you haven't slept well, or when you're just having a bad day. So it's kind of the world of George Orwell 1984 in a kind of reverse. So the state and political parties can see all of us. It knows exactly how we live. It can hyper-target us. It knows how we move. But we can also see the politicians. So they could look into our lives, but we can also look into their lives. So in this case, I'm going to define populism as politicians who juxtapose the people who are honest and sovereign and righteous and well-intentioned against a corrupt elite that's detached and disconnected and illegitimate and self-serving. Now, there are a number of studies which show that authoritarian populists use the internet with greater skill, and their messages resonate more easily and more loudly than progressive politicians. That there's a major correlation between using populist messages, the politics of right-wing outrage, and political success, particularly in Europe. So I won't list all these studies, but Sina Blasneg, University of Zurich, traced 36 leaders in 6 countries. Peter Maurer from France, the Media Lab at University of Pisa. I mean, go on and on. This is like the whole literature that verifies these understandings. Now, the number one, I have to say it, the politician in Europe with the largest online audience is Matteo Salvini, who until recently was the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy and the Minister of the Interior. He's now, as of September, in the European Parliament. And he has used Facebook in particular with incredible skill. So Facebook is there when he's watching TV, when he's shopping, when he's in the market, when he's eating snacks, when he's with girlfriends, when he's in crowds, when he's on the beach. And he's always doing selfies, and he's always doing videos at the rate of 10 a day with a staff of 10. The most popular video, political video in history in Europe is this one that he launched. Over the last few years, Italy has taken in 600,000 fake refugees, not escaping war, but bringing war here. And that's been his message. On YouTube, the killer's row, for lack of a better way of putting it, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, Milo, PragerU, Dave Rubin, Steven Crowder. Incidentally, Crowder reads the news every day on YouTube with a Glock pistol on his desk because there's like there's a fatwa against him, so I wonder why. But he has this gun on his desk, which he displays, and the message is, come into my studio and harm me and I'll kill you. Talk to anybody sort of under 25 about the killer's row, and they'll probably be able to talk to you about it. And of course, there's Donald Trump, if I have time, who has 66 million followers on Twitter. Now, a number of caveats. First of all, there are progressive politicians who use social media with great skill. These technologies are not preloaded in favor of authoritarian populists. So AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I mean, she's so agile, she's so cool, she's so savvy, she's so funny. I mean, she has built a huge audience. Bernie Sanders has built a fundraising Goliath. I mean, it's a fundraising behemoth, right? They can't knock him off because the fundraising is so formidable. Look at Hong Kong. And one of the things about Hong Kong is the way they put Twitter, they project Twitter onto skyscrapers and buildings, right? Like it's really interesting. Slut Walk, Me Too. The famous story of Carolyn Credo Perez, who's kind of a feminist hero in the UK. She's out for a run. She goes by the statues on Parliament Square. She sees that they're all men. So by the time she gets to St. James Park, she has set up an online petition. And within 5 or 6 hours, she gets 85,000 signatures, and she says, Twitter, it's like magic. And of course, there is a statue now to Millicent Fawcett, one of the suffragettes. Second caveat is we tend to lump all social media together. Each platform is different. Each platform has different affordances, different audiences, and different purposes. So in a major campaign, it's kind of like a multimedia chessboard where you play on different chessboards all at the same time. But each chess game is different. So Twitter, the audience is mostly male. I would say it's better educated. People have more money. So it's more elitist. It's where the political class meets. So that's where you'd put out policy announcements, right? That's where you'd have your policy debates. Instagram is a much younger audience, much more visual, more women. If you're doing your photo bombing, that's your audience. Facebook is a mass audience, certainly the most important audience in Europe. Facebook Live has become an extraordinary phenomenon. And Facebook still 2.8 billion adherents. It's quite extraordinary. YouTube is, it's where you launch political ads, and tell your backstory. And so somebody who's used it well has been the Liberal Party of Canada. They have used that as the launching pad for almost all of their ads during the last election. So major political parties run a 24-hour-a-day newsroom in which they hit all of the platforms all of the time in different ways and with different subtle messages. And the other thing I want to say is that, I'm going to run out of time here, but which I think is one of the most optimistic, I hope to get to Trump, but there's a new class of intermediaries online. There's a new class of information brokers. And so Twitter has reordered journalism, creating a new hierarchy among journalists. And there are some journalists who are now positioned as information brokers, as clearinghouses for information. So the old gatekeepers, the New York Times, the Globe, the CBC, they're still there. But there has been a transfer of power from the old gatekeepers, I think, to new influencers. And there's a new newsroom that's been created by these journalists. So let me give you some obvious examples. So from hockey, Elliot Friedman. Elliot Friedman is on Hockey Night in Canada. He's one of the most important sports journalists in the country. Every Sunday afternoon, he sits down and writes out 31 thoughts of the week based on what people are giving him, what other journalists, what the hockey players, what the hockey elite, what the management is telling him. And he puts out 31 thoughts of the week, which are then repeated by every other journalist during the week. One of the most interesting experiments, I think, and one of the most humane and extraordinary, is something that's going on right now by Lisa Sanders, who's the health reporter for the New York Times. And there's actually a program on Netflix about this phenomenon called Diagnosis. So she puts together people who are very, very ill and have never had a diagnosis with a vast worldwide medical network of doctors and experts. And this is, the stories are unbelievable. But she is the information broker that is making that happen. In Alberta politics, I'd say one of the information brokers is Jen Gerson. So people feed stories to Jen Gerson, and the rest of the journalists read Jen Gerson and come up with their own conclusions. So I want to talk a little about the way Twitter has transformed politics, and talk about Trump, and then I'll be finished. I don't know how I'm doing for time. So we all know that Twitter is the second window on events. So when we're at a sports event, when we're at a political event, when we're watching a leaders' debate, when we're watching a TV show, there's an entire audience that's watching with us at the same time on Twitter, sharing the experience, commenting. So an online community quickly forms around the event and just as quickly disappears. And I think that the notion of this second window and watching it collectively is extraordinary. Now I want to talk about Trump, and then I have to. He has 66 million followers. So Trump, as you know, has rewritten the script. He's rewritten the rules. And the way he uses Twitter is, first of all, to set the media agenda. If you're a reporter, it's not just lunatic ramblings by a guy banging around his bedroom at 2 a.m. He's the president. So he's firing cabinet ministers, he's announcing tariffs, he's interrupting testimony by, in front of congressional committees. He's announcing arms deals. You have to cover him. You cannot not cover him. And so by 8 in the morning, the journalists, their agenda is set. The news agenda is set around what Trump says. Now, he has a signature style, as you know. You could tell his, he ends off, it's sad or bad or shame or totally unfair or not good or crazy or so-and-so is a real dummy. I mean, it's you could tell that it's him. It's the politics of continuous outrage. The mob is always thrown red meat, and there's always an enemy. And so we've never had a leader who can use a technology to trigger a daily assault against his enemies by identifying them by name. And again, the torrents of extraordinary outrage. Another thing is Twitter is the principal instrument of party discipline. So if you're a Republican, and you veer off course, you wake up one day with an independent thought, which you're going to put online, you will be squashed like a bug. I mean, the leadership is watching you, you're being monitored, and you will be quickly punished. So the capacity, and this is the problem, incidentally, of, I guess there's a standing offer to Nenshi to go, Mayor Nenshi of Calgary to go to Ottawa, and his friends are saying, you will lose your independence, right? All the things that you have been saying on Twitter every day to your audience of 300,000, you can't do anymore. So the use of Twitter for party discipline is extraordinary. And then the torrent of attacks on the news media, which we can't ignore. The news media are variously disgusting, losers, crazy, dogs who will die like dogs, fraudulent, ugly, purveyors of fake news. And then he identifies particular journalists and says, you're crazy, you're a liar, you're disgusting, you're whatever. So a number of things going on is he inoculates his followers against bad news stories. So don't believe these guys. They're liars, they're creeps, they're jerks, they're ugly, it's all fake. And secondly, he takes the news story and he deflects it and says the real news is on Fox News. So if you want the real news on this, then you go not to those reporters, but to these reporters. So, and he is the only, at the end of the day, he sets himself up as the only believable source, the only one that you can truly believe. So, just bring this to an end. I think I could go on forever, but we are in a new place. Much of it is unrecognizable. Much of it is threatening and dangerous. But at the same time, it offers ordinary citizens and ordinary progressive citizens new avenues of hope and expression. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not using this. So I'm gonna give myself more space because otherwise I'm gonna knock this jug of water across the table with my extreme Italian hands. There's not enough Italians in the room to maybe find that funny. You can laugh at the Italians. Thanks, Dave. You should have maybe gone second because my speech is all bad. It's all extremely depressing. So there you go. Just beware of that. Interesting to hear that Jen Gerson's doing so well in her career. Someone who went to journalism school with her, it's like, oh God. But I've always wanted to debate Jen, and we were supposed to do it once on the 180, but she wouldn't debate me, so someday we'll have that chance. I also want to say hey to whoever's in the room from the Rebel Media. Don't know if you want to identify yourself? No? Okay, I assume someone's here from the Rebel Media. Because that's how they do it. So I have been asked to talk about my absolute favorite topic in the world, which is neo-Nazis online. I spent a lot of time with them. It's virtual time, it's virtual space, but the impact is real. And I want to first just read for you a message that I got 47 minutes ago. Okay. This is from a guy called Dusty. Now, we talked a little bit. He's a nice guy. He's actually giving me a heads up and also saying I'm wrong. He says, I see a lot of people saying nasty stuff about you and a whole round of threats on your life, and your address has been posted on numerous pages now, and people know you're arriving at your airport. I don't agree with that. There are other things to do other than stir the pot, Nora. So, as Dave said at the end of his speech, that this is dangerous stuff, and I mean, I'm not fazed by it, but I should be. I should be fazed by the idea that my address is everywhere online and that I'm constantly under attack for what I write. And that is because the principal location of organizing this new fervent far-right ideology, it is happening online, which I expect you all know. But in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how that's happening and what it looks like when you're the one that gets those threats and those hateful messages and whatever. And you can check out my feed. I mean, you can just see, like, I got ratioed yesterday for saying that hockey culture is misogynistic and racist. I mean, it's not super controversial stuff and is true. But you say that, and then the whole world is like, but Don Cherry was our uncle that we loved. And you're like, you know what? Like, people have better lives when they retire at 65. So, I mean, he could have, right? Like, he didn't need to keep working to 85. That's elder abuse, right? So a little bit of background about myself. So I'm a writer. I always wanted to do stand-up comedy. I was saying this last night to some folks, and I was like, I don't have to because I get to talk about Nazis in a serious way, and people always laugh at that. But I came to age politically in the student movement, and I also met the far right and neo-Nazi organizing in the same time. And it was very instructive because it was at a time where people didn't say, like, they were like skinheads don't exist anymore. Like, anti-racist action curb stomped them all and they all died, which is not true. But 2006, I was at the Ryerson Students' Union at Ryerson University in downtown Toronto. I was the vice president of education, and there was a Facebook group that had started. Now, Facebook was founded in 2004, so this is pretty early days. Most of us were all just looking to see, like, if anyone got ugly from high school still. And we saw that someone had organized a Facebook group called Proud Part of the White Minority at Ryerson. And it was kind of funny. Ryerson's a very diverse school, and a lot of people around the Students' Union was like, oh yeah, it's cool. Yeah, I guess, yeah, white people are in the minority. That's really sweet, actually. This university is really diverse. And so a lot of people joined, and it was like laughing and joking about being in the white minority at a Canadian university. But I grew up in a really small town, a really white town in Ontario, and I'm like the executive was the only one that had that experience. Most people came from either like a real city or like, another country. And I was like, you know what actually is happening here, folks? This is white supremacists looking to organize through a joke. And they're trying to get as many people as possible into a Facebook group and then find the one person maybe out of 500 who's actually going, oh, I'm actually open to this ideology. I'm actually interested in fascism. And so we very quickly started to condemn it, and I became the face of that condemnation because I had the most safety to be able to do that. And it went national. And I had to argue with, the National Post and talk radio about what white culture is in Canada and how it's not hockey and ballet. It's white. There's no such thing as white culture. And I got my first death threats. And the death threats were, I mean, compared to what I get now, really calm, actually. They were kind of nice. You know, I was like really freaked out that someone sent me pictures of Hitler, but like right now I would love that instead of my address being posted. And but one of the death threats was a phone call, and we had to get the police involved because, well, it was on a campus phone, and so I called security. I was like, "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" And they're like, "You're gonna explain to the police now that there's no white culture for 7 hours where we're being questioned." While the cops are like, "What are you talking about? Tim Hortons is white culture." And I'm like, "Yeah, great. That's why am I doing this?" And so we saw that glimpse in 2006. So I've been watching the rise of the far right online for a long time since then, and people responded with like incredulity that we were talking about any organized white supremacy within on a campus like Ryerson or in a city like in Toronto. And I remember we had a panel on racism at Ryerson, and Marcus G at the Globe and Mail had this column saying, "Racism at Ryerson, look hard or you'll miss it. Like it's not there," right? A lot of defensive, like, "Oh, that's how can you be talking about racism at Ryerson? This is a diverse school," right? Even though we knew, I mean, Ernst Sundel's house was Ryerson student housing, so like I've partied in that house. And if you don't know who Ernst Sundel is, he was a notorious neo-Nazi organizer in Canada, right? And that's a freaky house to party at because it was firebombed, so half the house is like, anyway, that's perhaps for another talk. Okay, so the internet has brought a lot of people together in different ways, right? You can find your own group of people based on whatever kind of freaky thing you're into, and the 10 other freaky people in the entire world who are into that thing, you can find each other, and you can actually perpetuate that kind of love of whatever thing it is that you love on these spaces. And so that kind of became obvious for a lot of people who were watching this world in 2011 when Anders Breivik shot and killed, 76 people in Norway? And Anders Breivik's manifesto was unbelievable to read. It was a shocking document. It was about 600 pages long. It was rambling. It didn't make any sense. But it laid the framework of what the new white nationalism, internationalist white nationalism would look like. In that document, he cited some of the work that we were involved in, actually, at Ryerson, at the Canadian Federation of Students Fighting Islamophobia. So that was really wild to see our, articles from our campus newspaper in his manifesto. And it was a truly global piece of literature where you could see that this guy is connected online to other people, right? We're talking 2011, so the internet's like, pretty ubiquitous then. Except he was talking about things at the time that people were had not mainstreamed yet. So he was talking about cultural Marxism, right? Or Marxist feminists, or these terms that actually became mainstreamed by someone like Jordan Peterson, who is not expressing directly white supremacy, but is seeing a generation of young people, and especially a generation of young men, who have nothing bringing them together for common cause or common activity. There is no place for a young man to get involved in stuff that isn't necessarily sports, and then even sports is not for everybody, obviously. And so there's this intense focus in our online spaces on political education for young men specifically. There's, of course, young women involved as well, but it's specifically targeted to young men. So 2017, Alexandre Bissonnette walks into the Centre Culturel Islamique in Quebec City in Sainte-Foy. It's about, 6 kilometers from where I live. And he goes on a shooting spree. And he kills 6 men. He injures 32. There's 4 children in the room. And we have to wait a year to find out what happened to this guy. How did this guy become so radicalized and hateful that he undertakes this act of violence? And Bissonnette pleaded guilty, so there's no trial, which was a small blessing. But in disclosure of the evidence that had been amassed against him, it was obvious that he was being radicalized online, that he was reading Ben Shapiro, he was reading Milo, he was reading basically all of those American, and actually among those Americans, there's quite a few Canadians, but the American internet space of the far right. And Bissonnette, he was ready to conduct his mass murder in November of that year, or the year before, 2016. He showed up at the Place Sainte-Foy, which is a mall. He had 2 guns with him. He loaded the guns in the parking garage. He went up to the mall, and he chickened out. He thought he may have been seen on camera, and so he took his backpack full of guns and sat in a Starbucks until he can calm himself down to go home. And so, and this is a kid who saw Columbine and wanted to do that from a very young age. This is all their stuff we found out during the trials. So it was someone who was obviously very troubled and who should never had guns, like number one. He wasn't a hunter. This was not someone that like used guns in any other way but to conduct violence against people. And it wasn't until Trump's inauguration and Justin Trudeau's tweet welcoming the refugees of the world to Canada that made him down a whole bunch of alcohol, go to the mosque, and kill 6 people. So we know that the online world is radicalizing young people, and I think that one of the ways that we have to look at how this happens is where and what are they doing in these spaces. There's been some really excellent investigative work done by folks at the Montreal Gazette, namely John Milton, Shannon's last name starts with a C and I can't remember it, and Chris Curtis, work also done by Marty Patriquin, that was made possible by anarchist activists, which was great, where they had thousands of entries of Discord logs on a chat server where they could see the far-right organizing globally, but anchored in Canada. And through those chat logs, we can see that what they would do is anyone who was questioning, they had answers to those questions. They would always amp up the rhetoric when people were trying to learn something about the way the world works, and there was very politically astute characters in these forums who were able to identify people who would be potentially open to this kind of radicalization. And so Discord servers or Discord chats are like kind of one of the most intense ways that this happens, because people are explicitly together for the purpose of, in this case, for far-right organizing, and they're closed spaces. So they're not spaces that I see. They're not spaces that almost probably any of you have seen. Or even if you are on Discord, you might be on Discord for other things, because it's not a service like for the far right. It's actually to chat, mostly for gaming. There's other places too. I don't know if anyone in the room's heard of Meta Canada on Reddit. Anyone hang out? Yeah, a couple. Yeah, boo. Yep. So. Yeah, I'm about to explain that. So Reddit is a popular, not the most popular. I think it's something like 9% of men and 8% of women are on Reddit, which was higher than I thought. But it's a place where you can post the news of the day or an issue of the day, and people can all comment underneath. Meta Canada is one of the kind of the places on Reddit where the far right, the worst elements of the far right, go and organize and coordinate their targeted attacks. And so if you are online and all of a sudden you notice that there's all these people responding to you about something, and it's like, what the hell is this? Where is this coming from? It's likely that it's being organized in places online like Meta Canada. And because Reddit has so many kinds of subreddits, like you can have a subreddit on literally anything, it's specifically Meta Canada that is a far-right location. Like there's other like Reddit/Canada or whatever. So that's, if you're interested in this stuff, I really encourage you to check out how people talk on Meta Canada. And that also kind of provides the intellectual base of organizations like Ontario Proud, right? Or Canada Proud. Or, I mean, Alberta Proud doesn't really need to exist because Alberta has its own like ecosystem of like shit, right? And it's like, you don't even have to have an Alberta Proud because that's Jason Kenney's fan club. And so then you have to go really, really far to the right to be successful in Alberta online. And so these folks, the Prouds, the Ontario Prouds, the Alberta Prouds of the world, they're funded by the same people, post-millennial. They're all involved with one another. And their sole purpose, of course, is to get the conservative message out, whether that means getting the Conservative Party itself elected or the United Conservative Party itself elected, or to just inform public opinion. So, you may have heard of this situation that I was in a couple of years ago. After the crash that killed 16 people, the players and trainers of the Humboldt Broncos, I had a Twitter thread where I pointed out very factually that the amount of money that was raised is like historically high, right? It's the highest fundraiser we've ever seen in Canada. And, you know, at the time it was 15 victims. The 16th victim hadn't died yet. And I posted a comment about how 15 women had been murdered in Ontario that year alone. So from January to April that year, 15 women, and I mean 15 women and their families. So I think there was 2 children who were murdered, a brother who was murdered, a mother who was murdered. And how it was striking that that wasn't even in the news, let alone getting money, right? That we unfortunately replicate systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic misogyny in death as we do in life. Like this is not controversial stuff. It's fact, right? When 11 migrant workers were traveling in a van in southern Ontario and 9 of them were killed, not only did they not make any money, but the 2 who survived had to fight deportation because they couldn't work in Canada anymore, and so they're not useful to Canada anymore. And so they were fighting their own deportation. That was in 2011 or 2012, I think. And so I learned very quickly that the online far-right world is not an organic place. It's an incredibly organized place, and they have nodes of organization that can make things go viral. And I know this because I was warned by a piece of shit who I won't name, who's a part of this world of horror, saying, watch your back, this is gonna go viral. And I was like, it wasn't a controversial threat. I mean, people say that all the time. It's, you know, not gonna go viral. The next day, I met a journalist for lunch who was covering Alexandre Bissonnette's trial. And this was, or the sentencing hearings. And the irony was not lost on me that a man who had just murdered 6 people in my town, was on trial or was having a sentencing hearing at the same time that I was declared the worst Canadian alive for saying things that are true and obvious. And the network between the Meta-Canadas of the world, the Ontario Prouds of the world, pushed everything up to people like Jason Kenney and Sarah Palin, which then pushed things out to be completely, colossally unmanageable. It resulted in me getting about a message every 8 seconds for a week. Okay, so you can imagine what that, like, I mean, my phone was like garbage, right? I might as well throw it out the window. And so, when you see that level of organization, you know, you could look at it and go, how does the left get that organized? How can we start threatening people? That's a joke, rebel media guy, okay? or girl, maybe you sent a woman. No, but what I actually think is that we need to, and maybe this is where Dave and I can have a debate later on, we need to think about whether or not these platforms actually are inherently more useful for the far right than for anyone else. Because while it is possible to be effective online, and there are wonderful examples of that, the online world requires our society to be atomized and individualized. And this, I think, is probably why I'm getting so much hate, because people are like, what, I played hockey and are you calling me racist? And I'm like, get the word systemic into a dictionary and read it, right? You know, these are issues where these are individual experiences versus a common or a collective or a systemic effect. And we live in a society where the commons or the collective has been obliterated by neoliberal economic policy, politicalness, and social policy. And so when you are online, it's your individualism that is the most important because you're acting as yourself. You're mitigating your interactions through a platform that is a for-profit platform that sees you as its moneymaker. And some of us are different kinds of moneymakers for the other. And it relies on us not understanding each other, because every time we don't understand each other, we engage more, right? And we're constantly on these platforms even more, which makes them more money. The fact that social media is a business often gets lost in a lot of this stuff. And so if we think, okay, well, Nora, you went viral with 33 million Twitter impressions in 7 days, who made money off of me? Because I didn't make any money. I got blacklisted by Maclean's magazine, so they can go to hell. And I also haven't been able to write for pretty much anything else that's been national, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, National Post. No one wants to take my pitches, which is fine, because they also can go to hell. But The reality is that other people did make money off of it, right? That it did generate content and it generated eyeballs onto the platform that people could then be advertised to, right? Isn't that funny? That's the new space that is managing our relationships with one another. And we don't come to that space equally because you have to be highly literate to use these platforms effectively. And not only are we not all equally literate, but just some people are just going to be more literate than others. Like some people are more talented at writing than other people are more talented at talking, right? And we've sanitized our personal connections through a lot of these platforms without really thinking about it and without really interrogating how that is going to fundamentally change society. Because we've instead thought, well, you know what, the movement has now just gone online, and that movement can still win. And sure, Me Too is a movement, but I haven't seen a single success that it's had, right? Other than, maybe taking down a couple of abusive men. But abusive men are not our problem. Our problem is of course, systemic. Our problem is patriarchy that oppresses us all, women and men and non-binary people, in very different ways, but oppressed nonetheless. So I don't have much time left, and I suspect we'll have some really good discussion in the questions. But I just want to leave a couple of thoughts in your minds about the uses of social media, right? So I've already talked about organizing, how they organize, how they educate, but the construction of status quo, maintenance of the status quo, or challenging the status quo online, that's really important. Because if every time someone who challenges the status quo is as attacked as I was attacked, what happens? No one wants to challenge the status quo because I can handle it, right? I have a partner who's like, yeah, give her, I love it. My parents are like, Ma, Nora, that's so wicked. Can you mention me sometime so I get some followers? I'm a freelancer, so I'm kind of impervious to being, well, I mean, I'm losing contracts, but I've gotten other contracts, so that's nice. I can handle it. I can't say to almost anyone else, you know what, you can handle it too. It's not that bad. Just say your truth. It's okay. You might get an anonymous complaint from Child Services, which I've received, but you can handle it, right? So when they use these platforms to harass and to silence critics of the status quo, we have to think of how we're going to then push back and protect ourselves, protect one another, or have we abandoned altogether that in-person, this real-life kind of magic where we actually also do organizing for real? And so I think for certain people who remember a world where we had community, where we did, do things together, where, there were fraternal societies, there's churches, there's whatever. There's things that actually forced you out of your house and interacting with people who you probably aren't necessarily friends with, but you knew their life business. You understand, of course, the need to do that. You were involved in movements where that was the way that you actually formed relationships and you were able to build capacity to change the world. For people who are my age and younger who don't have that experience, I want you to think very hard about how you can create those spaces as well, to be able to come into the real world and to be able to grow together in common cause and to create relationships that will withstand struggle. I always say that any platform where the other person who I'm talking to could be a cop is not probably going to be a platform that's going to be effective to challenge the state. And of course, police infiltration happens all the time, but in real life, it's a lot harder. So we have to be very, very smart about how we're interacting with one another online, and remembering that it is both real life and it is not real life, and figuring out how we're going to operate within those two poles. So thank you. You know what? And I'm going to grab this so that we can refill our. Disappeared. Okay. So no, it's right here. Oh.
So we have about 25 minutes for discussion, question and answer. So I'll ask that you identify yourself as someone who would like to ask a question by putting your hand up, and also to try to be brief so that we can maximize diversity here and have as many voices enter the discussion as possible, and to keep it short and to frame it as a question. So I see a person, sort of salmon color. Yes. And sorry, there was, yes, in the gray. And somebody over here in the blue. Yep. So we'll take 3 first.
Okay, holy cow. I forget how loud my voice actually is. I just wanted to say this and give a bit of context. I grew up in the foothills of Alberta, about 30 minutes south of where Terry Long had his recruitment camp for the Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. They used to come to my town and they would be rejected. In person, they weren't interesting. A friend of mine from high school just recently sent me a link for a thread that he'd started on Stormfront, saying perhaps you would be interested in this. I'm not, weirdly, because I'm not from the rebel media. But one of the things that he said was, I said, you rejected Terry Long 30 years ago. Why are you into this now? And he said, there's just more of them, and they make more sense. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the volume and immediacy of support and ideas when somebody says this. You talked about going viral, how that volume and immediacy of social media supports and reinforces these ideas.
Let's do 3 at a time. Yeah. So there was the person in the gray.
Hi, I was just hoping that Nora and David could talk a little bit more about that point that Nora made about debating potentially, whether or not the platforms are maybe engineered in a way that does benefit certain groups more than others, especially because I feel like maybe, I don't know much, but the right-wing interests in terms of, this type of populism is also very much so conveniently aligned with capitalist goals and money making. And so I'm just was wondering, the same people that you have in power of these organizations are going to benefit from, financially as well? Maybe even if they aren't bigoted and racist.
Okay, and then the third person in the blue.
Right here. So I had a question about Twitter, I guess mainly to Dave. Just on Twitter, there's lots of false information, and then there's experts come out of the woodwork to try to correct things, et cetera. And I just wondered if, when you monitor that, whether who's winning in that battle? Do the economists that come on and say, no, it works this way, do they make any headway against the other Twitter users who would take a different view or a false view?
Well, maybe I'll respond. First of all, I want to thank Nora for her talk. I was really moved, and I think there's nothing that she said that I would disagree with. But one of my reactions was, if you look at popular culture in Canada, who's winning that game? What does that game look like? Well, our most popular writer is Rupi Kaur, who's a 27-year-old Sikh woman who writes love poetry, who's been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, but is also, I think it's now, far and away the most important writer in terms of sales that we've ever had. And you go to, you talk to any young woman, right, and not any young, but many young women, they're very deeply moved by what she says, and also her courage in saying things about sexuality and race and maleness and all of that. Then Drake, who's a black Jew, is the most, certainly in terms of numbers on any medium, following, also just far and away the most popular. Lily Singh, there's another example. Margaret Atwood. Canadian popular culture is sifting and is doing a lot of the sifting and sorting for us in ways that are progressive, because our population is changing, and a young Sikh girl can get an extraordinary audience for what she's saying in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. So I think we have to respect that. The question here is, I think these narrow right-wing groups are self-reinforcing. And before they were isolated, and now they're online and they make 1,000 friends and people from around the world are cheerleading and they post something and it's an endless appetite for likes, and the likes, create kind of a high for people. So, can they be, it's really frightening. And studies show that when you're in a group like that, the more extreme you become, the more likes, the more popular you are within the group. And I think it's really scary. And I don't know, I just don't know where we go with that in terms of as a society. I know the police are watching, but that may not be enough. In terms of Twitter, who's winning, I don't think anybody's winning. I think there's a lot of scoundrels. There's a lot of false news. There's a lot of fake statistics. It's extremely dangerous, and I think people who go on those mediums should know how dangerous they are in terms of the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked who's winning the pop culture war, because that is so true. And watching Canadians' reaction to the Raptors was a really good example of that, of how basketball somehow brought people together, regardless of if they're from Toronto. We are at an incredible political moment, and I think that the reason why the far right is so seems to be on a rise, but is also just so intensely organizing. And we are talking about a small number of people, but it doesn't matter because they're so intense. Is because they actually know that Canadian culture is changing, because they know that for better, a lot of what makes Canada really suck is being replaced by things that are exciting and that are cool and that are representative and that can bring people together in a way that didn't also exclude people. Because we have to remember that Canada has always been a nation that has actively excluded people, while the people who were included were exalted and celebrated and told that they are the most normal, right? And if you are part of that exalted group, center of Canada, it's sometimes hard to see, and sometimes it's invisible to see what marginalization looks like, right? So that's all very positive, and that's why I'm actually not a pessimist at all, which is why, I guess I don't think socialists can be. And so I think that there's a lot of really excellent and fun stuff, although we have to mention that Rupi's book was knocked off by Jordan Peterson's book, right? So,
but not by real lovers, so I could say that.
No. And so, yeah, so the question about capitalism and social media, I think that the damage caused by Facebook and Twitter and these platforms, it damages our conversations for the reasons that I said. But there's also a way bigger and more obvious way that these corporations are hurting us all, which is that they're scraping our news industry's content, and then they're re-giving it to us, and they refuse to pay taxes, right? So these are corporations that don't pay taxes. It's like, I have to pay tax on on nothing, on crap that I shouldn't buy, right? And Facebook is just making tons of money off of all of us and will not give taxes back. That is a very dangerous attack on our sovereignty and our ability to fund our state. And I don't know in Alberta how much that conversation's happening. In Quebec, it's a huge issue because Quebec has managed to get some tax from Netflix and whatever. But I think actually that's the place that we see the biggest damage, because we're getting used to the richest corporations of the world operating here with impunity. And our government's yeah, we should get them to pay tax. It's yes, get them to pay tax. That is literally your job. We all have to pay tax. They can pay tax too. So that's a big problem. And how do we comment them? There's more than us. They make a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that this is why I engage with people online. A lot of people think that I'm nuts to respond to a lot of the trolls, and I am, right? But whenever there's someone who seems like there's a human behind them, I actually do respond. I don't suggest you do this, like it's a waste of time. But a lot of times I am able to talk to people and be like, what is this, what is it about this movement that's making you interested and feeling like you can actually identify with it? And I think that this is where you start to see that intersection, which has existed in Canada since Canada was founded, between economic anxiety, between complete social isolation, dislocation, and looking for a group that can make sense of the world for you. And so there's the individual way that we talk to those people, where we like try to figure out what they're anxious about and try to give facts and reason and appeal to their romantic whatever to make them go, no, like that's not this. Here's the solution, and that'll work in some cases. It might not work all the time, but then we have to also step back and say, okay, what are these broader forces that are creating people like Alec Manassian or like Alexandre Bissonnette or that are creating the hundreds of people that have decided to tell me to fuck myself today.
Okay, thanks. We'll take 3 more questions, little set. So there's a person in the back, dark blue, and on the left. Third. Okay, at the front.
Hello. So, David, you'd made a comment about how the social media allows politicians to get all of our data, but it also allows us access to politicians and their way of life. And I'm wondering to what extent that's actually true when I'm one of the many thousands of Calgarians who's been blocked by Rempel, #blocked-by-Rempel. And there was a case this week of Jason Kenney's live Facebook event and kind of came out after the fact and said, oh, it was a mistake by one of my staffers for deleting any negative comments about those events. And so, what avenues might be available to us when politicians are so able to shut us down or so able to block us. Cases of women who had written into their MLAs and then go to find out that they've been blocked access to their Facebook page if they've written a critical letter around government policy. So just to what extent that's actually true when that is something that we're seeing.
Here. And then there was, a second person. And then at the front.
Somebody first?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question is on the issue of digital literacy, which I think factors into what you're saying, and how huge an issue that is from all ages, and even including students at the best universities have been found to be digitally illiterate. And I'll give you one example of the 2016 election. Pope endorses Trump, which is one of the most repeated stories there. Where do you start when people take up that story? The Pope has endorsed Trump. I mean, where's the start? What do you do?
And then you can ask your question.
I'm just sitting here very anxious because both of you, excellent presentation, but in the outline it says, how come that the right wing is more effective than we are? And I would still like to get an answer. I'm thinking about the word to radicalize. One day that come in. Suddenly there was a new verb to radicalize. And I'm thinking about the movie called Black Klansman. And I saw the movie, I even bought the book, what I almost never do. And I wanted to find out about infiltration, because infiltration is a very old standby. That is, a technique to find out. And my question is, how come that we cannot do a better job then? We have excellent people. Trevor Noah, we had Rick Mercer, we had Greta coming to Alberta, and she's like a Joan d'Arc. How come we have such good arguments? And why, by a little bit more infiltration and find out how these other idiots do it, why can we not do a better job? It's a short question.
Yeah, so I'll answer these 2 questions and I'll throw it to David. I think I answered that to some extent already. Like, these platforms they reinforce rage, and they are not there to build new kinds of things in society. And on the left, that's what we want to do, is we want to build new things, right? We want to actually change the status quo. But I think that the real answer to that is more rooted in, is rooted offline, actually, in the reality that the left in this country is not as organized as it has been before and as it must be, right? To even infiltrate a group requires a level of organization that I don't know many leftist groups have currently. That being said, of course, there are people that are doing a bit of that work with some far-right groups, and we're learning a lot about how those groups organize thanks to the work that those folks are doing. But it's a general state, right? The left has not recovered since, I mean, we've been on a slide for 30 years, right? And the neoliberalism, neoliberal policy is the reason why the right is effective, because they, everything, even the most racist troll that is saying something that might not be reflected in a conservative party platform is still providing cover for that party to be able to have its anti-person kind of policy, that divide and conquer kind of approach, right? So it's more an issue, I think, with the left than it is with social media, and social media just amplifies where real life is in a lot of cases. Digital literacy is a huge question and a huge problem. I don't have the answer to that. I think one of the areas of digital literacy I'm most interested in is digital literacy of folks who are older than 50, and seeing how fast people were expected to become digitally literate in such a small period of time, up against people who were born with the internet and don't know any other way. And the reality is, on Facebook especially, the worst stuff that's shared on Facebook is shared by people of a certain age who just see something, they think it's funny, they share it, and a lot of their children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews are like, oh my God, right? And I hear a lot of young people laughing because it's literally every single person will say that's true, right? A friend of mine explained it to me like this. She's from Alabama. She said that in Alabama, people went from never reading a newspaper to having Fox News broadcast in their house on a 24-hour basis. And that jump is what made the people that she knows in Alabama just like their brains broke, right? And how many, similar to the Facebook thing, how many of us know someone whose house you walk in and CNN is always on? Or NBC is always on. And it is ruining the brains of a lot of our parents, right? And I'm not saying that to be kind of funny. It's a real problem. And then you spend time with them and they start saying, oh, well, yes, but this Manafort thing, and you're like, what are you talking about? You're from freaking Orangeville, Ontario. Who cares about that, right? Oh, right, because you watch CNN all the time. And so there's a huge gap in what we understand and don't understand about how older people have adapted to the internet. And it fuels a lot of, I think, of how information spreads, and unfortunately disinformation, whereas younger people are a bit more sophisticated with their disinformation, which is a different kind of dangerous.
Well, I would just like to...
We just lost our mics.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, why don't you take that?
Okay.
Yeah. Oppressed by technology again.
Hello. Hello.
It might be everything went dead at the same time,
Yeah,
so it might just be.
Dead.
Well, they need it for the camera.
So, your point was about Jason Kenney. I think it's an important one, but I'm trying to make a wider point as well about the politicians always being under surveillance.
Here, it's all off. No, they're all off.
So people in
they're not working
in our society are always under surveillance. Look at the police. Look at where cameras are. A week doesn't go by without some report on a policeman doing something wrong. Tasering somebody, a racist comment, arresting the wrong person, a mistake, somebody being beaten up. We see those films all the time. We never used to, but now everybody has a camera. And the police also have made a public policy decision, so they are wearing cameras. So they anticipate that we will have a camera, and now they have cameras. That's a different world, but we've seen a lot of news reports where the police are under surveillance. Doctors would be another example. So there's online sites where people report on their interactions with their doctors. And I had a student do a study in Calgary, and we took every 10th doctor, and what we found was going through those reports on doctors, that roughly a third of the doctors got extremely negative reports from their patients. This person came too close to me. This person, misdiagnosed me. This person put their hand where they shouldn't have. And all of that is online. All of that is public. And all of that explodes out once you go visit or are looking for doctors. So, we're living in a vastly imperfect world, but I think the power balance is better than it used to be. And, there's also dangers in cameras everywhere, and we have to discuss that, and reporting everywhere. But I think in terms of, making the world a little better, I think there's more justice today than there was because of some of those cameras.
Some question there. Sorry, there's a question right here. I don't know
Sorry.
if
Okay, somebody had their hand up first. We have time for one more question. Is there a burning question? And I would especially like to encourage somebody who has not yet asked a question at the conference today or yesterday. So if it's such a
How do we know that people who are evaluating these doctors are not operating under pseudo?
talking to the mic. People can't hear. Can you speak into the mic? It's not on. So then
Is it on?
for the camera.
For the camera. Oh,
there you go.
okay. How do we, in this case, people who make evaluations of doctors or businesses or whatever, how do we know that they're operating under their real names or some pseudonyms? There are apps that let you operate under a different email address, although it still may reveal your IP address, but you get my point.
Yeah, I do get your point. It's a very legitimate point. I do want to make another point, though, before I get to that one. And for Facebook, if you're a company, you can pay Facebook to deal with the reports that you get. So if you get negative reports, but pay a certain amount of money to Facebook, they will lower, so the good reports will be first, and then the bad reports will be backloaded to the end of the list. Now, in terms of people being, not honest when they report on a doctor or on a professor or on their lawyers, yes, that happens all the time. But my sense is at the end of the day, and this is what we found in this study, that bad doctors could not escape, their misdiagnoses. That they literally exploded online. It became an issue. They could not escape people's bad feelings or bad reports about them.
Okay, so we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our presenters. Thanks for all the questions.